All right, so let's get started here. I'm going to share my screen because everyone seemed to like that last time. Let's do this here. Okay, can everyone see the Narmer palette? That's what we ended on last time.
Yes, I see.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I've got a setting here. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Show small, no, that's not what I want. Sorry, technical difficulties here. Well, okay. What's happening here is I can't see the management screen, so that means I cannot tell if someone's asking a question or something, which isn't great. But okay. Anyway, we're gonna just deal with it. Okay. Looking here at Narmer's palette. So we ended last time talking about Narmer, who was the first pharaoh of ancient Egypt. He actually didn't use the term pharaoh. I'm going to talk about that, not this lecture, where the term comes from. That would actually be I think the next one. I'll actually get more into the etymology of the word and who started it. But without a doubt, he was the first king of United Egypt. That I can say without any sort of controversy. So Narmer did quite a bit in his time. So for being the first guy, first of all, what he did is he actually created a national form of government. He created 42 provinces called nomes, and the governor of each of those provinces were nomars. So this was a administration that would be recognizable to this day. I mean, it's United States. It's the United States of Egypt. Now, he also created a tax system. The tax system was primarily managed by the inundation. So, in other words, they would check this. They had the archaeologists have found these. They actually basically had these stone sticks in the ground that would measure what the inundation of the Nile was, and that would give them an idea of what the crop yield should be, and then that would be the tax basis for their people. And on top of that, he also created a system of trade. In fact, I don't know how well you can see here, but I thought it was a great idea to put the map behind me, but I don't know if you can really see it. But here's Egypt down here. What Narmer did was, this is his country, and there has been artifacts found from him all the way up here to Giza. So up to the right below modern Israel. And Narmer had a certain level of international trade, and this has been proven by the archaeology. He would establish a dynasty. Remember, I said there were 31 dynasties. Narmer would establish a dynasty that would go for 300 years. So let me just say, 300 years, that's like the life of the United States. This is one dynasty out of 31. So that gives you an idea of the span of time we're talking about here. The first dynasty lasts as long as the U.S. has been in existence. Now, God willing, the U.S. will be around a lot longer than 300 years, but I just want to give you the scale, the time scale. Now, I'm going to close this. I want to show you another item here. Okay. Now, I know this is actually obviously made for kids, but I thought it was good just because it gave you an easy diagram for me to explain a couple things. So since we're starting to talk about the kings of Egypt, about the pharaohs, I want you to have this diagram to look at. There's a few things about the pharaohs I wanted to mention. So there were 170 kings of Egypt. The first one, Narmer, started in 3150 BCE. The last one in 31 BCE is Cleopatra. So actually it's Cleopatra the 7th. The Ptolemies and the Cleopatras, if you were the male, you were named Ptolemy. If you were a female, you were named Cleopatra. So the Cleopatra everyone knows, as in Cleopatra and Mark Antony and Julius Caesar and all that. That was actually Cleopatra the 7th. So when she was kicked off the throne in 31 BC, that's considered the end of these pharaohs, these kings of Egypt. We already talked about Narmer. I want to mention this backing you see here is the Menes, and you'll see this on over and over and over, you see this on the pharaohs throughout time. The Nimes, there's some argument on whether it's supposed to represent a lion. I favor the argument that it's not a lion, but actually a cobra snake. I think if you look at the imagery of ancient Egypt, you certainly would see that matching more a cobra than a lion. But either way, only a pharaoh could wear it. So you see people in costumes that they always wear these things if they're trying to be like ancient, like dress up like Egyptians. Only the pharaoh would wear the name. Now, also I'll mention the Uraeus. That's the little snake you see up here. You have the false beard. That this false beard was worn by both male and female kings. And so but the funny thing is as important it was for their image for everyone to wear this little false beard, no one really knows the actual symbolism for this beard. It's just a guess. But what's cool is they don't even try to pretend that this thing is real, because if you look closely at any of the statues, there's always a little strap down the side of their cheek, just a very faint strap on the statue. So even the Egyptians are admitting, hey, this thing's not real, but all the pharaohs wore it. There's a couple of things I want to mention. One is the flail and the crook, right? So this and this. So these two objects were important for the two bases of the economy of Egypt, right? So the first is the crook, which was for, the crook was for herding sheep, and the flail was for separating grain. So every pharaoh has these two objects in their hands, and it's showing that, hey, they control the economy. They something I can use.
You have to mute it. Somebody
has to just kept my hands busy.
Okay. She has to mute herself, I think.
We okay?
There was just some other conversation going on. People need to be on mute if they can't be.
Right.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I wanted to give you the setup, but this wasn't really what I wanted to focus on. What I wanted to talk about was the pyramids. So if you looked at my topic for tonight, pyramids was one of the top three. And for us to get to the point of talking about the Seder, if you'd have some useful stuff to say at your Seder table, even though some of us will almost be having Seder by ourselves, nonetheless, I wanted to give you a little bit to discuss. So for that, I need to get to how the pyramids came to be. After Narmer's dynasty ended, after that 300-year period, it looks like the country he built kind of fell apart, and it would take it a number of years to reconstitute. But when it was reconstituted by a king by the name of Kazakem, by the way, he's got a great name. Kazakem just means the power has appeared. But anyway, when Kazakem came and reunited Egypt and created the second dynasty, now it would really be a kingdom to stay for a long time, even once his dynasty was gone. So the third dynasty is when things really get interesting, when we get to the point of what you would recognize as ancient Egypt. The first pyramid builder was a pharaoh by the name of Zoser. And Zoser was considered one of the greatest pharaohs of all time. He lived through the evolution of the burials to where, let me show you, when he first became king, this was an Egyptian burial. So let me explain. Before Zoser, in ancient Egypt, what they would do is that when their loved ones died, they would bury them in the sand. And it was very easy to bury someone in sand. It was obvious from the beginning of mankind that if you buried someone in the dry desert, their bodies would naturally be mummified. They would last a long time. But the problem with burying someone in a pile of sand is the jackals and other creatures kept digging up the bodies and carrying them off. And no one wants to see their loved ones get carried off in pieces by jackals. So the Egyptians figured out they would actually dig into the bedrock. So they dig underneath all the sand into the rock and actually create these little tombs in the sand. So forget this thing you see on top. Just imagine that what you see in this dotted line here, just this portion would be equivalent to what the Egyptians did. But then they determined that if everyone's buried underground, you can't tell who was special and who wasn't special. So that's when the mastaba started being built. So this is a mastaba. Now a mastaba is all that means is bench in Arabic. So when the Muslims first came into the area and looked at these things, they thought they looked like benches. That was the style of the day, and hence the name mastaba, and we still call them mastabas today. Now mastabas are commonly given to governments who have helped Egypt in the past. So because of that, there's actually 2 mastabas in the United States that you can see. You don't have to go to Egypt. There's one at the Met in New York City, which I don't think any of us are going to New York City anytime soon, but eventually you can go to New York City again. And the other one is in Chicago at the Field Museum. So anyway, there are a couple you can see without having to go all the way there. But what under Zoser, this mastaba system existed for the high and mighty. All right, now Zoser though had an advantage, and that is he had a guy working for him by the name of Imhotep. And Imhotep wasn't just any other guy. He was the world's first polymath. He's the first polymath in recorded history. He was a doctor. He was an engineer. He was an architect. He was and he was a high government official, so high, Zoser gave him a special title. He was the first vizier in recorded history. And this is important because it's the same title that Joseph had, that Yosef had. So obviously Imhotep wasn't Jewish, but the first time that title was used was for Imhotep. Now what he decided to do was he wanted to build something bigger for his king Zoser out of appreciation. So he had this idea that maybe he could build one mastaba and then a smaller one on top of that, and a smaller one on top of that, and a smaller one on top of that, and kind of stack it. So that's how we get to this file when it'll open. Okay, good. Now let me go here. There. So this top one is Zoser's pyramid. And you can see all it is a bunch of those mastabas stacked on top of each other. And the real thing is to the left here. So even Zoser gave his vizier credit for the design. And this is unique because in the ancient world, the kings got credit for everything impressive. They didn't give anyone credit. So that tells you even more about this Imhotep character, that the king of Egypt gave him credit for designing it instead of claiming it for himself. So, and let me also just add that the vizier, even at this time, if you reach that level, that was like your prime minister and president and everything all into one. The only, and chancellor, whatever titles you want to use, the only person the vizier reported to was the king, but he was to run the day-to-day government. Now, Imhotep would actually be worshipped throughout time. Over time, the Egyptians considered him a god. And when the Greeks came, he would be equated with the Greek god Asclepius. If we have any doctors on, they'll know what I'm saying. He was the Greek god of healing. So these two were merged under the Ptolemaic dynasties. Let's move on. Okay, so we have our first idea of a pyramid, but obviously the step pyramid doesn't look that much like the pyramid we identify with. So that's where we get this deformed pyramid, which is called the bent pyramid. Now, this pyramid was built by a king by the name of Sneferu, and for a lot of the Egyptologists, I'll hear them say Sneferu is their favorite pharaoh. He's well studied. In fact, hold on a second. I can even show you. There is a statue of him that's extant. Here's. I know it's not exactly the same thing as the picture, but there is a statue of him that he was the first one to have life-size statues, or at least ones that have been found. All right, so that's Sneferu. That's the guy we're talking about here. He was the first. So he's the first king of the 4th dynasty. He was the first king to build a pyramid. He was the first king to have life-size statues. He was also the first king to put his name in a cartouche. So if you remember from last time, the cartouche down here at the bottom. So he was the first one to start putting that little oval around his name, which would be vital for the future translation of hieroglyphics, as we discussed last time. I won't spend too much time on that again today. Okay, so let's get to this bent pyramid. So the first thing Zoser did is, actually, I think I've got to, I got to download this last minute just so I could show you. Okay, so the pyramid on the left is Zoser's first attempt at a pyramid. And what he did is he made a step pyramid, and then he put a bunch of limestone down the sides to try to make it smooth. But that limestone decayed, and the pyramid was not at the right angle, and the whole thing looked horrible, still well in Zoser's lifetime. It only lasted a couple years. I'm sorry, Sneferu's lifetime. It only lasted a couple years, so Sneferu was like, okay, let's try this again. So you got to give the guy credit. These are expensive tries. So now he does the bent pyramid. So with the bent pyramid, you're starting to recognize what we think of as pyramids. Now, what he did, though, is, well, it probably wasn't him, but his architects didn't do too good job of surveying where they were building. The land was unstable, and it started to shift when all that weight was started being piled upon it. And you see it deformed. Now, inside the pyramid, archaeologists have found cedar planks that they tried to shove up to try to keep the thing in shape, and they built extra walls to try to keep it in place, but they were not able to keep it stable, so they just left it. So his first two attempts, he just left.
Seth, where is that?
To attempt number 3, he's like, I'm not going to get crazy. I just want a simple pyramid. This is called the red pyramid because it's actually red granite, although the color doesn't give you a good idea of the red granite. But
where's that
anyway,
located?
Where's the red pyramid, his third attempt, was actually his first. The first true pyramid was this red pyramid. You're going to see that they get much bigger. By the way, had he actually been successful with this bent pyramid, it would have nearly been the size of the Great Pyramid. So he downgraded when he realized it wasn't working.
Yeah.
He probably was also running out of years. Like, he had been working on this for a long time. He probably didn't have a lot of time left, and so he was just trying to get something finished. So anyway, so Sneferu gets credit for having the first true pyramid, but I want to tell you a little story about Sneferu. This story is not for kids, but there's a Jewish connection to the story, so I have to tell the story. Okay, so Sneferu was bored one day, and one of his bureaucrats comes to him and says, "What's wrong, King Sneferu?" And he goes, "I have nothing to do. Everything's working. There's no problems. What am I supposed to do?" So his employee says to him, "Why don't you go sailing down the Nile, and you can ride with some girls down the Nile who are just wearing fishnet stockings and nothing else." And yes, it actually says this. So he's like, "That's a great idea." So he's sailing down the Nile with all these young girls wearing nothing but fishnet stockings, and he sees one of the girls on the boats crying. So he goes to the girl on the who's crying, and he says, "What's wrong? What can you possibly have to cry with? You're with the great king." And she said she had this turquoise amulet, and it was around her neck, and when she was rowing, it came loose and fell into the Nile, and it meant a lot to her. So Sneferu was generally upset that she was so upset, so he called his magicians, and they split the sea for this girl, and they were able to grab that amulet from the bottom of the sea and then release the water, and it came back. So, of course, we see the connection here. This is the first time in recorded history that we have a story of any body of water being split. But of course, this is the Nile and not the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds. Okay, when Sneferu passes on and is buried in his red pyramid, his son is going to take the throne. The great accomplishment of Khufu is he built the Great Pyramid. So when you go to Egypt and you see the pyramids, the largest pyramid was built by Khufu. And I have a picture of, I'll just have this to compare. Let's see, you've already seen this, but just so you have the comparison. Okay, so there's the step pyramid, there's the bent pyramid, and there is the Great Pyramid. So this is Khufu's pyramid, and it gives you some estimated years on here too, which you may find that interesting. And this is the most recognizable pyramid in Egypt. This is the top on everyone's list. But if that wasn't enough, Khufu left us something else too. He left us
Seth, where is the Great Pyramid located?
Giza.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Okay.
Let's see.
Cool.
I thought it opened. Hold on. Here it is. Oh, it's opening on the non-shared screen for some reason. 1 second. I'm going to minimize this and then move the. Here. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So beside his pyramid, archaeologists also found this boat. By the way, this boat is made out of wood from cedars of Lebanon. So, and I actually talked about the cedars of Lebanon in the Mesopotamian lecture too. But cedars of Lebanon were real, just like King Solomon tells us. And it was the only source the Egyptians had for wood. So cedar is found many times throughout Egypt. The reason being the dry air preserves wood rather well. So this boat was it was a ceremonial boat. If it was ever in the water, it was just to take his body to the pyramid after he died. And then it was buried right beside the pyramid. But it's amazing that this has been found and reassembled, and the preservation is incredible. So Khufu did quite a bit. I guess that's where you could argue that he outdid his dad. Now I'm going to talk. I like to take breaks from the history. So let's take a break and talk about pyramid building. Paul, you talked to me last time at the end about cutting the rocks, and I went to look up how the latest on how archaeologists think that the stones were cut, and the answer is everyone was right. So in order to cut the stones, you can see here what I was talking about with the wood, right? You see they have these are wood wedges here, and so they would get a crack. They would hammer away until they had a crack in the rock, stick wood wedges in the crack, and then pour water on them so that the wood would start expanding. So that broke the rocks off, and that was one of the reasons I said. Also, in terms of cutting these smooth sides down to the end, this is where the sand comes in that Paul was talking about. By the way, they did have saws as well, copper saws, but they weren't strong enough, so they used sand in there as well to help wear it down. In order to actually polish the statues, last time I heard about the statues specifically, they did use stone chisels and copper, which is what I had said, but they polished it with sand, which is what Paul had said. So that's why I'm saying basically it was all of the above. This picture on the right is kind of the latest archaeological discoveries. This ramp, the remains of this ramp have been found, and the big news was, yes, the ramp, but also there were these post holes evenly spaced out throughout each of the ramps, and that gave the archaeologists the idea of how these stones were moved. So if you look in our Seder or in our Hagaddah books, when we follow the Seder, you normally see guys pushing the stones on sleds, which they probably did to get it through some of the desert areas if they weren't able to float it. But this gives you a better idea of how they're able to lift the stones. And this is a very recent discovery. So you see they were able to get the ropes around the poles and pull it up that way. Now, the pyramids were built out of stone. I keep saying stone for a reason, which we're going to get to at the end. Where did the labor come from? So these were not slaves. There's multiple recordings, multiple writings that have been discovered of who built the pyramids. And the answer was it was a corvée labor. So what that means is ancient Egyptians did not pay taxes if you were of the lower classes. You didn't have money to pay taxes. What you did was for 3 months out of the year, the Nile would flood. And when the Nile was flooding, there was no way you could farm. So basically all this labor sitting there for 3 months without any work to do. So those 3 months were to serve the state. That's how you pay taxes, if you work for the state for 3 months. And during that time, that gave the pharaohs the labor force they needed for actually building the pyramids. So that it was not slave labor, it was more like taxed labor. The stonecutters themselves were specialists. So the guys actually, not the guys doing the labor here, but the guys doing the cutting would be highly trained specialists. Now, let's move back to our history here. Do we have any questions? I'll stop for a second. Any questions? Okay. Now I want to move on. So, yes.
Seth, the older pyramids, the Bent Pyramid and the other one, is that also in Giza?
Actually, no, that's in, let me look at it on my map here. 1 second. Drawing a blank right. It starts with a D. 1 second. Let me look at my map. Dashur. Right.
And that's available to be seen today? That's
yes.
That's a tourist destination. Okay, thank you.
Seth, this is Seth. I just want to confirm, based on what you just said about the labor, does that the pyramid was only being built 3 months out of the year?
The people who were professionals would have been there the whole time, but yes, the heavy labor would be during those 3 months of the year.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, now I want to move on and talk about Khufu's sons. He had 2 sons who ruled. The first one, I've got nothing to show you. His name's Giza. Giza left no existing statues, but Giza has one point of interest that I want to share, and that is that his name actually means Ra, he speaks. Giza, the god Ra. So this is the first time in archaeology that you have that sun god's name anywhere, and this is the same sun god who one day would give us the name Ramses. All right, so, but he gives us no lasting monuments, just his name. Now, his younger brother would take over in his stead, and his younger brother was a active guy. So let's take a look at him. Now, Khafra here did 2 impressive things. One is he built a giant pyramid, not quite as big as his father's. Here, this is good. These are his 2 great building projects. You'll recognize the other one immediately. So he built the 2nd largest pyramid ever, and his pyramid was only 8 feet shorter than his father's. So let me give you some stats on the Great Pyramid versus his pyramid. The Great Pyramid was made of 2.5 million blocks that were 2.5 tons each. Let me say that again. Wow. 2.5 million blocks that were 2.5 tons each. And you saw how much labor it takes to move each one of these stones. All right. It took 20 years to build the Great Pyramid, around the same time as it took his son to build his. However, his son also had the Sphinx to show for it. When the Great Pyramid was finished, it was 481 feet tall. That means it was the tallest building in the world until 1889 when the Eiffel Tower was finished.
Wow.
Okay, so you can look at the years here, but you're talking basically 2500 BCE, give or take a few years, all the way to 1889 of our era. So for about 4,500 years, these 2 pyramids were the tallest buildings on the planet. Not a bad run. I don't think we'll ever see that again. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Sphinx. So the Sphinx started out as just being a stone in the way. So it was this gigantic rock in the way of where they wanted to haul their stones. And this is again, if you look, the king gives himself credit for it because that's what kings do. I told you about that before. Probably wasn't his idea, but someone was like, we have this big knoll here, this huge knoll. Let's carve something out of it. So they carved the Sphinx. The Sphinx, to give you an idea, is 240 feet long, and at its highest point, it's 66 feet high. By the way, that is supposed to be Khafra's face here in the front. It's widely, it's not everyone agrees, but it's widely considered to be his face that you're seeing as the Sphinx head. It's symbolic. It's kind of a complicated symbolism, but it's basically looked at as kind of uniting the powers of heaven and earth. And it was, a Sphinx was also considered a solar deity. But of course, Sphinx is the Greek word, not the Egyptian word. Now let's talk about Khafra's successor, Menkaura. Menkaura, of these life-size statues, he actually left the best ones. So I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to show you a few things from Menkaura. Okay, so this statue of Menkaura is, you have two female deities. This is Hathor. Now, if you remember when I talked about the Narmer palette, I told you that was Hathor at the top, right? So this now you're looking at again, this is more of what Hathor looked like for the rest of Egypt, much more human-like. But you still have the horns, and you have the sun here. So anytime you see this female head with the horns and the sun, it's I shouldn't say anytime. Most likely it's going to be Hathor. There are others like Isis that occasionally use that symbolism, but just for a amateur, you can feel fairly confident it's Hathor if you see it. And then this, the deity here is Anput, and she was the representative of Upper Egypt. And she, by the way, this is Anubis. You always see him at the mummification, in the mummification pictures in the tombs. So that's her husband. So that's representing her, the goddess's husband behind her. So then if you're looking here at Menkaura, you should note that both goddesses are holding his arms here, which show that he has their support. That's the symbolism. And let me show you a couple more from him. This one is, there's actually, there's four of them. There's four of these type. I've got two to show you here now. I think I took two. One's a close-up. So this is, this right here is Menkaura and Khmer Enebti. That's his wife. So this time it's him and his wife. And you see that instead of just holding her arm, instead of just holding his arm, she actually has her arm all the way around his body, which shows more of an affectionate pose than what the goddesses were showing. And then let me show you. I just want to show you a close up because you really get an idea of what their faces look like when you see it zoomed in. Wow. It's amazing stuff.
So, and I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it seemed like on the goddesses picture, they also had their arms completely around them. Crystal noted this, if you look at their thumbs, that each hand is from the goddess.
Oh, you think it's from the other? Yeah, it's on the opposite. Yeah, but it's still it's on the arms. It's not on the body. That's what I was.
Okay, all right, got it. Thank you.
Okay. And then I just want to show you this. I like to mix in some of the archaeology. Sorry that I should have found a higher resolution photo, but this is what these things looked like when they were found, just to show you what they looked like in the ground. And of course, these are life size. This is like pretty much the size of a normal human. So these things are pretty big to be buried underneath like that. Okay, now let's move on. So Menkaura did build a pyramid, but it was much smaller than his predecessors. So you had kind of the red pyramid of Sneferu, and then you had then you had Khufu's giant pyramid, and then you had Khafra's, which is almost as big. And now you go down to the next generation, and it's like half the size. And so what I did is I just grabbed this image because I thought this gives you a better idea of how small these things got. So there's Khufu's, there's Khafra's, and then there's Menkaura's. So you can see the building projects got smaller and smaller and smaller. So the fourth dynasty died out. And I should stop for a second and mention why are all these dynasties dying out? They're dying out because really because of interbreeding. So over and over again, the pharaohs would only marry their sisters. And what happens after 2 or 3 generations is infertility results. So either they thought that it didn't apply to them or they didn't recognize reality, but over and over again, the families made the same mistake with this inbreeding. And over again, you're going to see after, even you have a couple great kings, after 2 or 3 generations, they stop being able to have children. And so dynasty after dynasty is going to die out of even, so for rather non-violent reasons. Rarely did any of them die out for violent reasons. It was mainly from infertility. So the 5th dynasty, there's, again, the 5th dynasty, I don't have so much to show you, but I just wanted to mention a couple interesting points on the 5th dynasty. One is
question.
that,
Question.
Yes.
When the dynasty dies out and they have a new dynasty comes into play, how are they chosen? Who decided, or how was it decided that, you know, Fred will take over from Joseph?
Right. So there were some violent occasions.
Yeah.
I think the most common occasion in peace would be that some general or high-ranking official married the daughter of the previous pharaoh, if there was a daughter. Or perhaps it was another relative of the last pharaoh, you know, a distant cousin who was selected. There could be various criteria, but the one that I see more than anything else is someone marries a female relative of the last pharaoh.
But you're saying it was mostly pretty peaceful. They didn't have big battles to
Well, there were, but yeah, the majority of those 31 were a peaceful transition.
Interesting.
Okay, so the 5th dynasty just had a Joseph connection I wanted to mention, and that was that Userkaf, a king under the 5th dynasty, was the first one in recorded history who selected a vizier based out of merit. So Imhotep was a noble when he became the first vizier, but it was Userkaf who first said, hey, this administrator is so much better than everyone else. Who cares if he's a commoner? I want him to be his vizier, which it gives us another hint to the story of Joseph. But what's best about Userkaf is the titles. So we have a list of titles from his palace, and I just want to read you the names of these positions. He had a head of a palace, okay. He had the head of the butchers of the palace, the head of the palace manicurists, who were 2 males. It was a co-position, which tells you something about manicurists. Controller of the robing room, overseer of the clothes, administrator of every kilt, overseer of the king's breakfast,
Okay.
and my favorite, chief of the secrets of the bathroom. Because you have to remember the pharaoh was supposed to be a god, so he couldn't really go to the bathroom like a normal person would, right? Because a god doesn't need to go to the bathroom. So it's a pretty important position to cover up that secret. All right, so that's the 5th dynasty. I can't go through every single dynasty, so we're gonna hop around here. All right, so we're gonna go to the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom, and this is the 6th dynasty. And the king I'd like to mention is the last king of the 6th dynasty and the last king of the Old Kingdom. His name is Pepi II. And Pepi II, it's interesting. The interesting thing about Pepi II is this. So that's his mother, and that's him as a child. And by the way, always in Egyptian art, children are like miniature adults. You know, in actuality, the proportions are different. But the way Egyptians portrayed children, they were just miniature adult dimensions. So you see that example already here. That would stay with the rest of Egyptian art. But Pepi II, it's funny, we only have an image of him as a child because he would live to be the oldest pharaoh ever. He actually ruled, depending on whose dating you use, somewhere between 85 to 94 years. Let me say that again. He ruled somewhere between 85 to 94 years. His parents died when he was a small child. He became king and ruled well into his 90s, potentially as long as to the age of 100.
Is that a world record, Seth?
Yes. So that was my next line. He is the oldest reigning head of state. You will find other you know, some duke of whatever
Yeah.
who can argue they lived longer. But this is the longest reigning head of state in recorded history, Pepi II. He, by the way, Elizabeth II, if you want a comparison, she's the closest comparison we have in the modern world. She's now been reigning for about like 68 years, 67, 69,
Wow.
about 68 years. So she's got to go another 30 years to beat this guy. And maybe she will. Now, the downside of Pepi II is as he was getting older, he was losing power. And potentially there could have, there's speculation that maybe he was getting senile, but they didn't know how to function when the Pharaoh's getting senile. All of his heirs died out. He outlived all of his heirs, his children and his grandchildren, which is a problem. Not only that, he went through 10 viziers because he kept naming these viziers. Even if they lasted very long, he was on the throne for so long, they couldn't live long enough to serve him. So a lot of instability followed his rule. And when he died, so did the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom completely fell apart at that point, and we hit this period. Remember, I just said he ruled for 90 years or so, and now we're going to hit this period where in the next 20 years there's 17 kings. So almost a different king every year. So imagine the instability compared to what these people are used to, and that's what he was facing. Now, I'm going to stop with the history, and I'll go through a little bit of analysis for you here, because I promised I'd give you some more fodder for your Seder, and I'm going to do that. That's the end of the Old Kingdom. If you remember the last lecture, I said the Old Kingdom was the kingdom of the pyramids. So this also means that the pyramids are done. Yeah, there'll be some other kings that build these really small pyramids, but the Old Kingdom is the pyramids. Pepi II dies, pyramid era is done. It's not going to come back. Next, we have the Middle Kingdom, which I'm not going to get to today. That's the kingdom of the literature. That's where all the great stories come in, besides the Sneferu one, which I had to use tonight. And then the third great era is the New Kingdom, which is when our Exodus lecture is going to take place, when we get to that. Now, I want to give you a few things, leave you with a few things. One is, I want to talk about Flinders Petrie. I want to continue that. So Flinders Petrie, I'm thinking most of you on here heard my first lecture. If not, I'll post it in the chat afterwards. But he was our archaeologist who was the star of our last lecture. And I want to talk about what happened to him after he retired. So if you remember, I told you that he was the greatest archaeologist of his day. He was the one who trained Howard Carter. Howard Carter is the one who found, I'm sure is Mike Carter's cousin, but Howard Carter is the one who discovered King Tut's tomb. But the most significant finding of Flinders Petrie himself is this, and I'm going to talk about this more when we get to the Exodus lecture, but this is the Menarpta stela. Menarpta was a son of Ramses II. He was actually the 13th son. I'll talk about that more later, but he actually led an expedition through the Sinai into what's now modern Israel, and he erected the stela. What's significant about this is it's the earliest textual reference to the people of Israel. And it's the only reference to the people of Israel that's actually been found in Egypt. Okay, so this is extremely important for any sort of biblical archaeologist. And you can see the translation here. So you have this gigantic stela. There's one little line in here that says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Now, we talked about hieroglyphics last time. There's a determinative, and this determinative is very important for dating. And I'm going to give you kind of a cliffhanger, but the determinative actually does not mean the nation of Israel. It means the people of Israel. And again, he came right after Ramses II. So this is going to be very important for our Exodus lecture, but that's your cliffhanger. So that's all I'm going to give you on that. I do want to talk about what happened to Flinders Petrie afterwards. After he finished his career in Egypt, he actually moved to he moved to modern Israel, or what would become modern Israel, and he volunteered and taught in Israel. He did some archaeology in Israel, didn't make any great discoveries there. But the story I want to tell is after his death. So he decided he wanted to donate his head to science when he died. This sounds repulsive for Jews, but remember, he wasn't Jewish, he was Protestant. So it's not our problem, okay? All right, so this good Protestant wants to donate his head to science. His body is buried at Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and his head was put in a jar to be shipped to London. He died in 1942. Now, what was going on in 1942? There was a minor event going on in the world called the Second World War.
Yep.
So it took a long time to ship things at that point in time. And it took a couple years for this jar with his head to get to London. And by the time the jar got there, the label had fallen off and no one knew who or what it was. They just kind of put the jar on a shelf. Well, wouldn't you know, here's where an Israeli comes into the story. In 1989, there was an archaeology student by the name of Shimon Gibson who got hooked on reading about Flinders Petrie, and he wanted to find out what happened to his head. And with a lot of hard work, Shimon tracked down the head in London and identified it. And it was proven to be a positive identification, so his head was found. It only took 50 years. Shimon Gibson, by the way, graduated as an archaeologist, got a PhD, became a professor, and he is now a professor of archaeology at UNC Charlotte, so not too far from here.
Wow.
So anyway, that's Flinders Petrie. And then my final section for you tonight is to talk about bricks. And it may seem like a boring topic to talk about bricks, but my discussion of the pyramids and how the pyramids were built was to get you onto the discussion of bricks. Now, everyone listening tonight should be able to say, without a doubt, the Jews did not build the pyramids. Why? I'm not quizzing any of you. I'm going to give you the answers. Okay, so let me give you the little reasons first. First, there's already records that multiple records saying that Egyptian labor was used and professionals were cutting the stone. All right, that's your first hint. The second is distance. The Torah tells us that the Jews were building in Pi Ramses, which is in the Delta. Hold on, let's get our map up here. Here's our, that's not the map I wanted. That's the map I wanted. So the Jews are building here in this area. See Avaris? They're in this area near Avaris. And the pyramids are down here in Giza. That's over 100 miles apart. So I can assure you they are not carrying items 100 miles from one to the next. So the distance tells you something. But the biggest proof is the simplest proof. That is, the pyramids are made out of stone. What does the Torah say Jews built with? Brick. Okay, so it's very clearly stated Jews were building with brick, and the pyramids are made out of stone. So that's your number one reason why you know Jews did not build the pyramids. And your final reason, by anyone's dating, be it archaeology, be it rabbis, even be it Christian ministers, there's about 1,000 years difference between when the Great Pyramid was built and when the earliest Exodus could have happened. So it's a tremendous period of time. And you may be able to fub 100 years here and there, but you're not going to fub 1,000. All right. Now, I want to give you some more interesting things about bricks that archaeologists have found, because it adds a lot to our Exodus story. Now, the first is we know that the bricks were made to build storehouses, because the Torah tells us that we built storehouses for in Pi Ramses, right? These great storehouses. The storehouses were, in fact, made out of brick. Brick was used for a couple applications. One is you use brick for just cheaper construction. Making bricks was cheaper than dealing with stone. Also, it's how long you want something to last. If you were building a temple or a pyramid, you wanted that to last forever. But something that wasn't expected to last forever, believe it or not, was a palace. Because every king knew the next king would replace his palace. I mean, they weren't stupid. So they could save on building costs. They could use bricks, but bricks had another advantage, and that is they actually stay cooler in the day and warmer at night. So they'll absorb the heat through the day, which makes them cooler to the touch during the day. And at night, they radiate that heat to keep those bricks warmer. When you're out in the desert, that makes a big difference. So bricks are much better for palaces, and because they were cheap, they were much better for storehouses. Brick making has been found to be and proven to be made by slaves in archaeology. There's actually a tomb from an 18th century official, a guy by the name of Reckmeyer, and he's got these paintings of how bricks were made. And in the paintings in his tomb, you can see a Nubian, which is an African, now Sudan. Nubia is where Sudan now is. But you had a black African slave, but working side by side, the black African slaves were Semitic slaves. I'm not saying these were Jews, but they were clearly identified by there was a certain style to identify where people were from, and they were drawn to be Semitic people working as slaves in ancient Egypt, making bricks, which sounds very familiar. So we've established brick making as a slave job. Also want to talk about a couple papyrus documents that have been found. One of them, excuse me, I got to look at the names here because I always forget. The Anastasi III was talking about quotas for brick makers, and this will sound familiar. Likewise, the people who are making bricks, they're making their quota, their daily quota of bricks every day. So that sounds familiar. We talk about quotas for bricks in the Torah. We talk about straw. Straw was very important. Now remember, when Pharaoh first starts getting annoyed with Moshe, what's the first thing he does? He says you have to keep your same quota of bricks, but without the straw. And once again, in archaeology, it comes through for us. We see that that straw is repeatedly discussed for making bricks. And there's a couple of details here, right? So we know that that this happened during the month of Nisan. Now, what's interesting is this was not the harvest season. You only got straw during the harvest season, because the way ancient Egyptians got straw is during the harvest, they go through and cut all the wheat, and then they left these little stems in the ground, and those stems were kind of mowed up and collected as chaff, and that was what was used, the straw, for brick making. So once a year, all this was accumulated and stored by the Pharaoh. So it's especially cruel that Pharaoh told the Jews they had to keep their quota